Today, we are reviewing a strategic piece that argues ERP migrations are fundamentally data strategy decisions, not just technology projects, and outlines the architectural shifts required, like canonical data models, to prevent migrating legacy data debt into new systems. The diagnosis of the underlying problem is exceptional, but let's jump straight into our first area for structural improvement. The material effectively diagnoses data debt as a structural flaw, but it misses a critical opportunity to address the executive incentives that actively encourage this debt to be migrated rather than resolved.
Yeah, right. The text makes a really compelling argument about the mechanical miscalculations organizations make during these massive transformations. It points out that data debt travels with the organization simply because changing these structures introduces, risk and scope.
Right.
But it frames this almost as a logical fallacy that leaders just accidentally stumble into. The weakness here is that the text completely overlooks the human and organizational realities driving that behavior. It ignores why leaders make this category error in the first place.
Well, as I understand it from the notes, the author treats the decision to lift and shift bad data as basically a failure of imagination.
Yeah, exactly.
But if we look at a standard, massive IT project, a project sponsor is explicitly incentivized to hit a specific go-live date, right, and stay under a really rigid budget.
Oh, absolutely.
They are absolutely not incentivized to build a decade-long strategic data capability.
Right. And because the text ignores that this is often a completely rational survival choice based on an executive's key performance indicators, the argument remains purely theoretical.
Okay, so how do they fix that?
Well, to make it pragmatic, the suggestion is to reframe the discussion around data debt to explicitly challenge how executive KPIs are structured during migrations. The author needs to shift the focus from simply changing the architecture to fundamentally realigning the project's success metrics from day one.
It really reminds me of building a massive skyscraper. Like, if the lead contractor's bonus is strictly tied to getting the roof on by a certain Tuesday,
Right.
they simply will not care if the foundation is slightly crooked, Are we asking the organization to build a better data foundation without changing how the contractor gets paid?
I will actually take your skyscraper analogy a step further. It's not just about a missing bonus for the contractor.
Oh,
Yeah. The CFO might actively penalize the contractor for pausing to pour a new foundation because, well, it delays the ribbon-cutting ceremony.
wow, yeah, that's true.
So the author needs to address that direct financial and political penalty. Right now, the text is just pointing at the crooked foundation.
So if the author needs to tell a CFO or, like, a project sponsor that they must care about data debt, they have to provide a mechanism to enforce that care.
Exactly.
How does a company actually change that incentive structure, practically? It's one thing to say align incentives, but how does that look on a spreadsheet?
For a concrete improvement, the author should include a paragraph detailing exactly how a CFO can adjust the migration scorecard to enforce this.
Okay,
For instance, they could make the canonical data model definition a gated milestone tied directly to the release of the next tranche of project funding.
Let me stop you there because gated milestone is a term that gets thrown around a lot. What is the actual mechanism there?
Right, it can be vague.
Does that mean the system integrator literally does not get paid their next $10 million installment until the data model is approved?
That is the exact mechanism. You make it mandatory for funding release.
Wow, okay.
Because if it's just an optional work stream, it is the very first thing that gets value engineered out when the project inevitably runs 3 months behind schedule.
Yeah, of course it is.
The author could explicitly contrast a traditional project manager's KPI, which is typically system uptime at go live, or finishing under budget with a new data strategist KPI.
what would a data strategist's KPI look like in this context? Practically speaking.
It would be a metric like achieving 100% machine readability of core transactions for real-time compliance.
Okay, I see.
Highlighting that tension between the PM, who just wants the system to turn on, and the data strategist who needs the system to yield usable intelligence, brings the theoretical argument right into the boardroom.
But changing the contractor's KPIs is only half the battle, right?
Right.
Even a well-incentivized team is going to hit a wall when they finally open up the legacy systems and realize they don't even know what language the data is speaking. Which brings us to the architectural gap in the text.
Yes. Once we realign those executive incentives so the team is actually rewarded for doing the hard work, they have to figure out how to build the solution. Which brings us to how the text introduces the canonical data model.
Let's dive into that.
The introduction of the canonical data model in data orchestration layer feels like an abrupt leap from problem identification to an advanced architectural solution without a clear operational bridge.
Yeah, let's look closely at how the text sets this up. The author outlines 3 major architectural failures. Migrating old models instead of redesigning them,
Right.
treating data quality as a one-time migration problem, and designing data exclusively for ERP consumption rather than enterprise intelligence.
Exactly.
And then suddenly it presents the canonical data model as the ultimate fix.
Yeah, and after thoroughly detailing those systemic failures, the piece essentially drops the canonical data model onto the reader's lap. The weakness is the sheer magnitude of that jump.
It's just too fast.
Way too fast. For a technology leader currently drowning in legacy ERP complexity, dealing with inconsistent master data, customized naming conventions across 20 subsidiaries, and decades of technical debt, this leap feels immense.
Yeah, I'd imagine.
There is absolutely no transitional step explaining how a company actually begins mapping this canonical standard when their current data is an over-customized mess.
If I am reading this and I have 50 disconnected entities globally, doesn't the text risk leaving me stranded on the wrong side of the canyon?
Exactly.
Telling a company they need a canonical data model without showing them the first step feels like a massive oversight.
It is. So, the suggestion here is to introduce a transitional triage phase in the structure that breaks down the initiation of the canonical data model.
A triage phase. Okay.
The text needs to show the reader how to take the very first step before trying to define the final organization-wide state.
Okay. But telling a company to start with a triage phase sounds great in theory. But if I have 50 legacy systems, how do I not just spend 12 months arguing in committee meetings over what constitutes the starting line?
Right, analysis paralysis.
Does the author give a framework for that?
They don't currently, and that is what they need to add. As a concrete example, they should add a section right before the canonical data model titled something like the triage phase.
Okay.
In this section, suggests isolating just the top 20% of critical data elements to serve as a pilot.
Wait, I want to challenge that 20% number.
Oh.
Yeah, in a massive enterprise, 20% of the data model could still be thousands of tables. Isn't that still too daunting for a first step?
You know, that is a fair pushback. The author might want to be even more surgical. Instead of 20%, suggest starting with the top 5 universal business entities.
Top 5? That's way more manageable.
Yeah, think of it like trying to draft a universal dictionary for the United Nations. You don't start by translating every single regional dialect at once.
Right. You start by agreeing on the absolute fundamental words: water, food, and shelter.
So in an enterprise IT context, the author needs to tell the reader what those fundamental words are.
Yes, those words are usually things like vendor, customer, and item.
Ah, okay. The author could provide a brief, relatable scenario showing the mechanics of mapping just one single data element.
To show how it works in practice.
Exactly. Show what happens when the German subsidiary system calls it Kunde, the legacy US mainframe calls it customer, and the recently acquired tech startup's database calls it user.
Walk me through the mechanics of that scenario. Like, how does a canonical data model actually resolve that conflict?
Well, the canonical model acts as a central hub. The author should explain that you don't force the German system or the US system to change their internal language immediately.
Oh, you don't?
No, that would break everything. Instead, you create a central definition. Let's call it global business partner. Then you build a specific mapping rule for each legacy system that points to that central hub.
Okay, I see.
Once the reader sees the step-by-step mechanics of mapping one single element across 3 systems, the prospect of tackling the entire operational architecture becomes significantly less daunting.
That makes the concept incredibly tangible.
Right.
But figuring out how to start is only helpful if you haven't already started. There is a ticking clock aspect to these massive projects.
Very true.
What if the organization is already halfway through the implementation?
And even if they figure out how to start building that canonical model, there's a practical reality of timing. which leads to our final area of focus.
Let's get into it.
While the material perfectly outlines what a data-first migration looks like from day one, it neglects the reality that many readers are likely already mid-flight in a traditional technology-focused migration and require a strategy to pivot.
Yeah, the text ends by stating that the best organizations spend the migration window designing the future and notes that the window closes at go live.
Right.
It is a powerful sentiment, but it fundamentally assumes a blank slate.
And that is the core weakness of the conclusion. It assumes the reader is in an early design phase. It provides absolutely no actionable advice for an organization that is 6 months into a $50 million migration.
Right.
An organization that just read this document realized they are making the exact category error described and cannot afford to stop the train entirely. It leaves that reader feeling helpless.
I have to agree. If I am a CIO and I realize my program is currently migrating data debt exactly as this text warns against, I can't just walk into the boardroom and say, well, we need to halt the migration, throw away $25 million of sunk costs, and start over to build a canonical data model.
No, definitely not.
I would be fired before I finish the sentence.
Exactly. So the suggestion to fix this is to add a specific course correction module. This needs to be tailored for readers who need to introduce the canonical data model or data orchestration layer into an already moving project without completely derailing their established timelines.
Hold on, you are dropping a term like data orchestration layer here, and the source material does it too. But we need to explain what that actually is and how it functions mechanically.
Sure, that's fair.
If a CIO is trying to course correct mid-flight, what exactly is this layer doing for them?
Think of an orchestration layer like a universal fuel filter sitting between the old rusty gas tank and a brand new engine.
Oh, I like that.
In this case, the old systems are the rusty tank, and the new ERP is the engine. The orchestration layer catches the messy data, cleans it, translates it in transit, and feeds it cleanly to the new system.
Okay, that makes sense.
The author should include a mid-flight intervention checklist. One of the first tactical steps is explicitly advising the reader to immediately freeze all new custom business logic in the ERP core. Stop customizing the core software.
So, mechanically, if a business unit says, hey, we need a special rule for how we calculate discounts in Europe, instead of hard-coding that into the new ERP, where does it go?
You push that logic to a minimum viable data orchestration layer. You intercept the data before it gets to the ERP, apply the discount rule in the orchestration layer, and pass the clean, standard result into the ERP.
Wow!
Yeah, this stops the bleeding of technical debt into the new system.
That explains how to handle the data flow, but it doesn't solve the timeline issue.
Right.
If the project is scheduled to go live in 6 months, and building this orchestration layer and canonical model takes an extra year, how does the CIO survive the board meeting?
That is the million-dollar question. The author needs to map out a specific technical fork in the road, decoupling the intelligence go-live from the transactional go-live.
Unpack the mechanics of that decoupling. Why is it safe to separate those, and how does a business actually do it without breaking their daily operations?
By decoupling the go-live, you allow the transactional system to just focus on keeping the lights on. The transactional go-live happens on the original deadline.
Okay.
The business can still print invoices, process purchase orders, and ship physical products. You meet the board's deadline for operational continuity.
But what happens to the reporting? If the transactional system is just keeping the lights on, how does the CFO know what the margins are?
And that is the genius of the decoupling. You route the reporting data into a separate environment.
Oh, interesting.
The author must explain that by launching the transactional piece first, the data strategy team buys themselves an extra 6 months. They use that time to clean the reporting data, build the canonical data model in the separate intelligence environment, and launch the intelligence go live later.
So it's staggered.
Exactly. It transforms a fatalistic warning about a closing window into a dynamic, life-saving strategic maneuver for a project in distress.
It's easy to say, start right. But giving them that pivot strategy is crucial. Can we offer them a parachute instead of just telling them they shouldn't have jumped out of the plane?
Yes, exactly. The parachute is the orchestration layer and the staggered go-live.
So, a key theme running through this critique seems to be the critical importance of moving from a high-level diagnosis to deep, pragmatic execution.
Absolutely.
To recap the three structural shifts we've explored, first, we discussed the absolute necessity of addressing executive incentives around data debt. Leaders aren't going to fix structural problems if their KPIs financially punish them for the delay.
Right.
Second, we identified the need to bridge the gap to the canonical data model with a highly focused triage phase. A reader facing decades of legacy complexity needs to see the mechanics of mapping just the top 5 data elements before they can tackle the whole enterprise.
Completely agree.
And finally, we explored the need for a mid-flight pivot strategy. Organizations already deep into a migration require actionable steps like utilizing a data orchestration layer and decoupling their go-lives to course correct without completely derailing their established timelines.
To implement these structural shifts, the actionable suggestions for the author are very specific. First, detail the mechanics of changing the scorecard by making the canonical data model definition a gated milestone tied to project funding.
Yep.
Second, build that triage phase section using the universal dictionary analogy, walking the reader step by step through standardizing a single concept like vendor.
Right.
And third, provide that mid-flight intervention checklist, explaining exactly how to freeze custom logic in the ERP and route reporting to a separate environment to buy the data team time.
The foundational argument of this source material is already incredibly sharp. The diagnosis of how data debt travels like a virus is spot on.
It really is.
By incorporating these structural adjustments, the author will move beyond just telling the reader what the problem is and deeply explain how and why the solutions work.
Exactly. If the author maps out the mechanics behind the KPIs, the triage phase, and the orchestration layer, they will transform a compelling observation into an undeniable, indispensable strategic playbook that technology leaders will actually use.
We highly encourage the author to implement these suggestions and submit their revised work back in for another round of feedback in a future critique. Remember, if we are asking an organization to build a better foundation, we cannot just point out that the current one is crooked. We have to address how the contractor gets paid, we have to draw a clear starting line in the dirt to break the political deadlock, and if the project is already mid-flight, we have to hand a leader a functional parachute, not just a warning about the fall.